Okay, hello everybody. This will be, I believe, video number 3. I'm not sure, but I have been putting more reading assignments up on D2L. So check it, a couple times a week. I have all the first drafts of every essay I've received so far. I'm missing a few, but those of you who have sent me a draft, please check your email. There should be a return in there with my comments. And as far as revisions go, I can give you all till next Friday to get those in. Not this coming Friday, the following Friday. Okay. So that's basically the schedule that we're on now. I'll try to put all that stuff up on D2L so you can check there. So this is basically how we're going to be finishing off the semester. I hope you all are adjusting. It's a little bit different, but we got to do what we got to do. Um, I will be making some other adjustments. For example, I'm no longer going to require research for any of the essays. You can do research; it's optional, as you know, for any essay. But the last essay, I was going to have you do a research paper. I'm not going to require that anymore because some people may not have access to the databases. There's too many different variables. I'm not going to be able to go over again how to do the properly use the databases and all that. So we're just going to make adjustments as we need. So that's all I just want to go ahead and announce. So for this section, we're talking about Raymond Carver. Now, Raymond Carver was born in Oregon, not far. Well, he was born in a place called Clatskanie, Oregon, and he was born in 1938. He died in Washington State, Port Angeles, Washington, in 1988. So, like many of the authors that we've been talking about this semester, he did not live a very long life. He's 50 years old when he died. He died of lung cancer, and he was a heavy smoker. Wow, imagine that, died of lung cancer. He's pretty interesting guy because he does have quite a high reputation among American writers. I mean, some people have considered him among the best American writers. I don't I don't have much of an opinion on that one way or the other. I do enjoy his work. He did pretty much exclusively short stories and poems. To my knowledge, he never published anything of a novella or novel length. For as far as I know, it was all short stories and poems. And he's also very, very well regarded in both of those spheres. As a short story writer, one of the best, most well respected, many awards, and for his poetry too. So a lot of writers can't really exist in those two worlds. They're either really good at one and okay at the other, or really good at one and terrible at the other, or really good at one and they don't even touch the other. At least in my experience as a reader. But he was very, very well respected as and still is. I keep saying was is very well respected as both a poet and a short story writer. His poetry is sometimes compared to I would say more along the lines of a Robert Frost type poetry, a lot of nature, a lot of wilderness. He himself was a huge fan of the outdoors. He loved fishing. That was one of his favorite things to do, was just to get on a small boat, go out on a river, lake, pond, whatever, and just do some fishing. Um, so he grew up in a very kind of working class household. His father worked at a sawmill. Basically, was a logger, um, where in Oregon, where there's big sawmills where they get all the logs. That's what his father was, a foreman for a logger, and Carver himself did that for quite a while. His mom was a public school teacher, so there was not they weren't they weren't broke or poor by any means, but they were definitely blue collar, definitely working class, and that's very, very clear thematically through almost all of his stories and his poems as well. Most of his stories deal with either, kind of working class, lower working class, lower income families. They're usually dysfunctional in many different ways, but, like I said, about a good man is hard to find. I mean, to some extent, every family's dysfunctional, so I don't really like that designation that much. But his families were highly flawed. His characters were all highly flawed, and with as with many of the writers that we read, not for just this class, but just in general, a lot of the characters, settings, environments, themes are all pretty closely related to the author's actual experience, and their life, and it's particularly evident in Carver's writing. His characters are, well, a lot of, when we talk about different styles of writing and different types, how we want to put everybody in a little box and say, well, this guy's this type of writer, and this person is this type of writer. And his stuff has been described as minimalism as well as dirty realism. Um, Now, the minimalist thing I can kind of get behind, because if when y'all are, when you guys are reading the story, you notice that he doesn't use a lot of complex sentence structures. It's very straightforward. Uh, he doesn't use a lot of kind of academic vocabulary, but what I call 50-cent words. Words that people use to impress than to actually get a point across clearly, because when you're using words that people have to grab a dictionary to find out what you're saying, it ruins the flow. It's to me, it's more like someone trying to show off. Look at these big words I know. His work is very straightforward. So the minimalist thing I kind of get into. I get behind it. I can understand that. I'm not sure that I really like the designation dirty realism, because when I read his stories, I see a lot of realism, that's for sure. I mean, I see a lot of reality in it, but I guess if you want to take that stance, then reality is dirty. So in that case, I can sort of see the dirty realism, but I don't know. I think that's just that doesn't really it doesn't do his writing justice, is what I'm saying. But it is what it is. People want to put things into categories. We all do. I do. Everybody does. People ask me, you guys know I like horror movies. People say, well, what's your favorite horror movie? So, well, you got to pick a type. Is it this type of horror movie, this type, from this period, this, whatever. So we do like to categorize, and that's what he got stuck into, was dirty realism and minimalism. Um, and I suppose it fits. He also, if you all remember when we were talking about Flannery O'Connor, I mentioned and spoke to some length about the Iowa Writers Workshop. After he graduated with his bachelor's degree, he met a person that got him. He started publishing, basically, and he published a few short stories. And he also, just like O'Connor, through someone that he knew, kind of a mentor of sorts, got recommended for the Iowa Writers Workshop, and he was invited to it. And He did not graduate. He completed, I believe, he completed about half the program, and then he quit. Now, while he was there, he became pretty close friends with another student, another writer who was there as a student named John Cheever, and they became pretty good friends. And they also became really, really good friends with alcohol. And it was during this time that Carver became very, very, very dependent on alcohol. He became a pretty heavy alcoholic. He ended up not graduating from the workshop. He dropped out, started doing a lot of odd jobs. You know, he basically was doing all kinds of stuff. He was kind of like a jack of all trades, but master of none. As I said, he worked in the sawmill. He worked as a janitor actually at a college. And like if any of you have ever seen Good Will Hunting, you know that with Matt Damon and Ben Affleck. Well, Carver was actually a janitor in a college, and part of his what he was able to do since he was employed by the college is he could audit classes, which means you can attend the classes, but you're not getting any credit for them. You don't have to pay for them. You attend them free, but you're almost like a just a visitor. So you can sit in on the classes, you can do all the coursework. The professors will give you feedback and all that if they do. You know, we know some do. But he would attend these creative writing lectures at at the college where he was basically a janitor, a night cleanup guy. And through there, he made more connections and just started publishing short stories. And he ended up getting published in some pretty big Esquire magazine published one of his stories. And he just started getting a more of a reputation, but he also started getting more and more into the alcohol, which basically dissolved his first marriage. And he reached a pretty low point. You know, he was having to borrow money from friends and kind of couch surf. No, didn't really have a permanent place to stay. Eventually, he got himself cleaned up. He quit drinking completely and began a really, really prolific period in his writing career. And that's when he just hit his stride and became, you know, during his lifetime, became a pretty successful writer. He would teach as well. He was teaching at several colleges and universities. Stanford was one of them, where he was teaching creative writing. Uh, so he ended up becoming pretty successful during his lifetime as a writer. He won numerous awards. He would get stipends. Uh, these awards that he would win were generally, for the time period, were pretty significant amounts of money. So he would teach on the side part-time, and then he would write. He would win a stipend, an award, or a grant, and he would write more. So that's basically how he lived his life. And unfortunately, he quit drinking, but he never quit chain smoking. And you'll see that reflected in Cathedral in the story. The blind man Robert, smoking one cigarette down to the nub and lighting a new one with it and smoking that one. That's what I mean by chain smoking. And that's kind of how Carver lived, smoked, and it cost him his life. He died at the age of 50 of lung cancer, and that's pretty much a very, very short and scattered biography. But as I said at the beginning, he's immensely, immensely respected as a writer. Mainly, I think, because of the rawness of his writing. It's kind of like, at the minimalist, dirty realism, whatever you want to call it. It's very direct, and I think what the description minimalist means is that he doesn't waste words. You're not going to see flowery, what people sometimes call purple prose. very, kind of Victorian type, just overblown, where the writer will use 30 words to say what could be uh, said more effectively and more profoundly in 7 or 8 words. So that's how he wrote, and um, I'm hoping that you guys kind of noticed this as you were reading it, that these are very kind of just very direct, very to the point um, sentences, and the structure is it's simple. His writing style is somewhat simple, but kind of like Hemingway's, very similar in that aspect. But I don't want you all to mistake simple for empty. Simple sentences, simple phrases, simple diction, all of that. It can have immense meaning behind it, and conversely, on just opposite, someone who can write these really long, complex sentences with lots of big words in them, they can use a whole lot of words, make it sound real fancy, but if you really dissect it and look at it, they're actually not saying much of anything, if anything. So I do like his style, and this particular story, Cathedral, I absolutely love this story. And hopefully you guys notice that at least I think it has a happy ending. Now, you've been in my class all semester, so you know that a lot of our stories are not happy stories. They don't have happy endings. I mean, we just did a story where an entire family is murdered by an escaped convict. So this one, nobody dies. So at least you got that going, going for you as readers. So I change it up a little bit. So now let's go ahead and just get into the story in a little bit more detail. Now, first, I want to kind of preface this by saying maybe another reason why I like this story so much is that my dad was blind for, I'd say, totally blind. He had a rare disease called retinitis pigmentosa, and it's degenerative. Your eyes just gradually quit working, and I would say probably for the last 15 years of his life, he was almost 100% blind, and for the last 8 or 9 years of his life, he was totally blind. Um, and for my dad, it was a lot different because the character in this story was, as far as we can tell, was blind for his entire life, or at least from a very, very young age. So he doesn't know what it's like to, which makes more sense in the story, particularly what they're doing at the end. My father could see for 50 something years, so kind of a different thing where he knew what things looked like, he just could no longer see them. This man never knew what they looked like. He had to be told what they looked like, and through creative measures we see that he is shown, if you will, I'm using it like that, shown what a cathedral looks like by this other man, and we know how their relationship starts off. So if we look at the characters, this is a first-person narration. Okay, so we have one narrator. Now, we don't ever know this guy's actual name. He's just Bub, uh, and that's the name that, kind of the unofficial name that Robert, the blind man, gives him. So as far as the story goes, characters, it's pretty simple. You've got 3 characters. You've got the narrator, Bub, if you will. We'll just call him Bub. Kind of like Wanjero versus D. So we have Bub, the narrator. We have his wife, and then we have Robert. And Robert is the blind man. Now, if we're going to talk about themes in this story, I would say that there are several themes, but the themes are pretty simple. And also, another thing that I think makes this story relatable is the themes are relatable. They're things that a lot of us fear, a lot of us are uncomfortable with, and common emotions that most of us have. Fear of the unknown. Now, this man, Bub, the narrator, he clearly uh, does not understand how his wife can have a relationship of any kind, really, that's not sympathetic. That's an actual genuine friendship with a blind man. He's got. It's almost like a cliche if you think about it. It's like, who's the real blind person? And at least for the first majority of the story, it would be the narrator, Bub. He's the blind one, in a figurative way. So he feels very uncomfortable about this blind man being in his house. It's almost like fear of the other, fear of the unknown, uncomfortable. And he does what so many of us do, and I think you guys definitely know this from being in my class, is that, sometimes when people feel uncomfortable, they switch off to jokes, to humor, to making fun of stuff, to making making light of something, whether even if it's something that's rather serious, they just start making fun of it or whatnot. And you can see that very early on, and also to an extent, prejudice. Now, when I use that word prejudice, I'm using it in the true meaning of the word. We've touched on this in class before, but today, in today's society, when people hear the word prejudice, they think automatically, kind of a knee-jerk reaction, they equate the word prejudice to racism or sexism, or some kind of ism that has to do with gender, race, sexuality, something like that. It can be. People can definitely have a prejudice for things of matters of gender, race, and sexuality and all that stuff. But prejudice itself doesn't necessarily have anything to do with any of those. The word prejudice literally means prejudge. It means to make a judgment before you have adequate information to make an informed decision or draw an informed conclusion about something. So when I say that this guy is prejudiced, don't do the normal knee-jerk reaction and go, well, he's a racist. That's not what I'm talking about. He has a prejudice against blind people, particularly this specific man, because he's making a prejudgment based on, in my opinion, completely flawed information, stereotypes. Um, as you see, in the beginning of the story, he says, that his knowledge of blind people is limited to TV and movies. Well, this story was published in 1981, um, and if you think of the character as an adult, he was growing up in the 50s, and in a lot of, even any of you now, if you've ever seen like any of the old Looney Tunes cartoons or old 50s like Three Stooges and stuff like that, whenever they'd show a blind person, it was always a caricature, not even a stereotype. It's just a straight up caricature where the blind person would have on, the dark glasses, usually the circle glasses that were just solid black. For some reason, they'd have like a fedora, some kind of hat on, sometimes a trench coat, to make them look as seedy as possible, and also a cane, right? And we know, yes, blind people do use canes to get around. Although my dad never did. He was, "Oh, I don't want to make me look old." I'm like, but Dad, you don't need a cane to make you look old. You look old. But anyway, that was this guy's his litmus test. His base was basically this one. And he also made a very common assumption that many people even today still make, is that blind people are helpless, that they are totally helpless. They can't do anything on their own. So his prejudice is there, and he's not particularly shy about hiding it. Definitely when it's just he and his wife talking, before Robert shows up. Um, he's Now if we actually look at the text, you can see that there's a gradual shift. The very first line, the first three words are "this blind man," an old friend of my wife. So he says "this blind man." So this person is just Robert doesn't even is not even really a person at this point. He's just a thing. He's this blind man. And then he has to throw in an old friend of my wife's. He was on his way to spend the night. His wife had died. Okay, so this guy's just being, it's like he's reading a news report, or reciting a news report. There's no emotion. He has literally no sympathy that this man has just lost his wife, which is I mean, come on, that's a horrible thing. So he was visiting the dead wife's relatives in Connecticut. The wife isn't even humanized. She's the dead wife, not even his dead wife, just the dead wife. This completely, almost as if she's just a goldfish or something. This blind man's goldfish died, so he's going to Connecticut. There's no sympathy. He's dehumanizing the wife, the wife, as well as Robert. Now, a lot of that could be just, again, it's his insecurity coupled with his fear of the unknown, his being uncomfortable. And I'm not justifying by any means or making excuses. I'm just saying this is possibly a very real scenario that could take place. Now we learn a little bit of the history that through this man's own narration, Bub's own narration, we learn about all of his insecurities and his flaws unintentionally. Now remember, I told you all that narrators, or first-person narrators, can be very, very important because they can tell you a lot more about themselves through what they're saying about others than they can about, than just someone else describing them or someone else narrating their story. Now, I talked about narrator reliability as well earlier. This narrator right here, Bub, I would say this guy's about as reliable of a narrator as you can possibly wish for, because he is so just blunt, direct, and honest that he's showing us all of these flaws, these prejudices that he has, and just how unlikable he is without realizing that he's doing it. You guys know what I'm talking about, where people say, "Hey, man, keep talking. Just keep. You want me to give you a shovel and see if you can dig that hole any deeper? Keep talking, man. Like if you watch those crime shows when police are interrogating people and they're just burying themselves, telling their stories. So this guy is not by any means an unreliable narrator. I'd say he's a ultra reliable narrator, so much so that he doesn't realize that he's basically projecting all of his shortcomings and flaws and his prejudice to the reader. And he's also very literal. He says in the second paragraph, he's talking about how his wife met Robert. That summer in Seattle, she had needed a job. She didn't have any money. I mean, that's about as literal as you can get. Well, why did your wife need a job? Well, she didn't have any money. Makes sense. That's pretty logical. So, of course, we know that's how she meets Robert. She takes a job reading to the blind. Now, this story takes place a long time ago. So services like this were pretty rare. There weren't a lot of now. Anyone who wants to listen to books can listen to books without problem. Just get Audible or whatever. Well, in the early 80s, books on tape were actually very expensive. So she would read to the blind. Now, we also learn right at the beginning that another character flaw that Bub reveals to us through not even realizing that he's doing it, is that this guy is extremely insecure, which is also a cause for the byproduct of jealousy. He's extremely jealous. We learn that his wife was married before. He's the second husband. Now, how does he refer to the first husband? Never by name. He just calls him the officer. He was an officer in the Air Force, and he's just like that guy. He refers to Robert as the blind man. Now, even though Robert never had any kind of physical sexual relationship with her, he almost acts like he had because he touched her face. Well, you guys know that thing, how, blind people will try to see what somebody looks like, get a sense of it by doing. For him, that was almost a violation. He's extremely jealous. He considers this some kind of intimate act, and I guess in a sense it is, but this guy's very insecure about his standing with his wife. He relegates the first husband as to just a thing. Robert's just a thing. That blind man, that Navy guy, or Air Force guy, I'm sorry. Or her officer. He refers to the man as her officer too. And we also learn that his wife, at one point when she was married to the Air Force officer, that she had actually tried to commit suicide. That she took a bunch of sleeping pills, drank a bottle of something, vodka or wine, a bottle of gin, and tried to kill herself in the bathtub. So we've got a lot of very unstable people here out of the three characters. In fact, Robert, the blind man, Robert, seems to be the most stable out of the three. So again, this would be that kind of realism. Now, I don't want to call it dirty realism to me, because to me it's not dirty. It's just realistic. These are real problems that real people have. These people are not cardboard cutouts. So he pretty much is making a joke out of this. Before Robert arrives, the man says, and he's getting increasingly uncomfortable because he says, now this same blind man was coming over to sleep in my house. So he's like worried that this guy's going to be sleeping at his house. So he tells his wife, maybe I could take him bowling. Ha ha ha. Yeah. And the wife, at this point, she's obviously very close to Robert. They've been sending tapes back and forth to each other for at least 10 years. And the wife simply says, if you love me, you can do this for me. If you don't love me, okay. But if you had a friend, any friend, and the friend came to visit, I'd make him feel comfortable. So she's saying, just come on, knock it off. And again, he's showing his insecurity. He says, well, I don't have any blind friends. And she says, you don't have any friends, period. So we're getting the sense that this guy's fairly unlikable, at least at the beginning. Now, he makes fun of the wife's name. Her name was Beulah, and he says, that's the name for a colored woman, which again, he's showing prejudice bordering on racism at this point. Now, we really see his prejudice in this next part when he does start talking about the wife Beulah. and he's almost wondering if the wife was if she the only reason that he could think of why she would even want to marry a blind man is out of sympathy. So we see just how narrowly focused and just completely flawed this guy's logic is. He says in this, okay, all right, so he says, she died in a Seattle hospital room, the blind man sitting beside the bed and holding onto her hand. They'd married, lived and worked together, slept together, had sex, sure, and then the blind man had to bury her. Again, he's still the blind man, not Robert. All this without his having ever seen what the goddamn woman looked like. All right, that just shows just exact how shallow this guy is. He in his mind at this point he cannot fathom how a woman could love a man who can't see what she looked like. You know, he even says, a woman who could go on day after day and never receive the smallest compliment from her beloved. So again, this is showing just his shallowness. He in his weird belief system, he thinks that you can't give someone a compliment if you can't see them. Uh, y'all, I hope I don't have to really elaborate on just how narrow-minded that is. Um, I'll just leave that one as it is and let you make up your mind. But he's not a very likable person at this point in the story. He keeps trivializing their relationship. I'm talking about Robert and Beulah. Um, he's just, and this is all in the story. This is all before he's even got there. Uh, Now he sees his wife laughing as they're getting out of the car, her and Robert, and then he's getting jealous again. Um, he talks about the way the guy's dressed. He can't believe that a blind man has a beard. Y'all, if any of you can come up with why he thinks that's strange, email me, tell me, please call me. I want to hear. Because for some reason he thinks it's strange that a blind man has a beard. Now let's look at this logically. Um, and it's particularly, okay, guys have to shave, right? It's not fun, it's not enjoyable, but it's a tedious thing to do even when you can see what you're looking at in the mirror. Um, Shaving blind does not sound to me like it would be a very easy chore, nor something that I'd want to do on a continuous basis. So to me, it makes 100% perfectly logical sense for a blind person, a blind man, to just go ahead and have a beard. My father, when he went blind, grew a beard out because he couldn't see to shave. You know, so again, this is just an example of this guy's um, his just completely uninformed, uh, basic prejudice that his point of reference is what he's seen in TV and movies. So a very flawed individual. But again, all of this stuff is whether you agree with any of it or even like it. I don't. I dislike this man, but it's very understandable and realistic, which is part of why Carver's reputation as a realist was so highly regarded. His characters had real people flaws. They weren't, you know, nobody was 100% this or 100% this or this side or this side. They were just real average people. no Superman, you know. Um, Now he goes even further with his misunderstandings and just complete misconceptions when he's shocked to see that Robert smokes. He's like, "Well, how can a blind person smoke? Why would you smoke if you can't see the smoke?" Um, Again, I have no clue where that would even come from. If y'all have any ideas, please share them. Now, things really start to kind of mellow out, if you will, as they're eating their dinner, because if you all keep track and notice, all three of them, the wife, Robert, and Bub, are consuming massive amounts of alcohol. Now, I told you earlier talking about Carver, and again, this isn't always true, but you know, a lot of writers write about what they know. Well, we know from what I told you earlier, Carver himself was an alcoholic, and he was also a chain smoker. So we see a lot of this reflected in the story. Well, alcohol tends to loosen people up. The more they drink, the more loosened up they get. And of course, the wife gets extremely tired after they want to add a little fuel to the alcohol. So Bub decides to break out the weed, and the three of them all get stoned. Now they're really relaxed, and the wife is passed out. So this point in the story, I hope y'all could see a very clear turn. I mean, it's not a long story, but by the time you get to about page 9, this is where the if you want to use the term, the climax of the story takes place, because the wife's no longer in the picture. She's still on the couch, but she's asleep. She's passed out. Now it's just Bub, the narrator, and Robert. And of course, he gets a little uncomfortable, but he's more relaxed because he's basically drunk and stoned. Now, as they're watching the television, this is kind of the eureka moment for Bub in the story. Robert just very kindly asks him, he says, "You know what, Bub? I've never seen a cathedral," stating the obvious. He's blind, he's been blind. And he asks if Bub, the narrator, can describe it to him. Well, he does his best, but we know, it's not very good. He's like, well, they're tall, they're big, they're made of stone or marble. They have these things called buttresses on them. He's not doing a very good job, but he's also he's starting to feel at this point in the story, if you can tell that by the way he's talking, his tone has drastically changed. He's feeling actually quite comfortable with Robert. And Robert, as y'all have probably noticed from the beginning, this guy is not lacking in confidence or self-assurance. He's very, from the get-go, I mean, he's got this booming voice. Um, he's not arrogant by any means. I'm not, please don't misunderstand me. He's just a very confident, he's knows who he is, and he's perfectly fine with it. Whereas the narrator, Bub, in my opinion, doesn't really know who he is, and he's very uncomfortable with himself and insecure, which is why I think he's taking a lot of this out on Robert, and where a lot of his jealousy comes from. But at this point, they're kind of coming closer together. They're kind of finding a common ground, and now they have, if you will, some sort of a mission. Bub has to figure out a way to show, figuratively, Robert what a cathedral is. And he said, "Oh, they got gargoyles and stuff." He said, "Well, how would you know what those are? You don't." He's really at a loss. But it's Robert, the blind man, who takes over at this point, and he becomes kind of the leader, the teacher. He said, "Hey, come on, go find something to draw on and something to draw with, and you and me will draw one, and you can show me what it looks like." Now that this is without question the climax of the story. Um, he's given him details. We go this way, we go this way, and if you get towards the end, now it's Robert who's taken over. I put in windows with arches, I drew flying buttresses, I hung great doors. I couldn't stop. The TV station went off the air. So at this point, the TV's not even on anymore. So he doesn't even have a visual reference. I put down the pen. The blind man felt around over the paper. He moved the tips of his finger over the paper. Now remember, he could actually, they're drawing on a grocery bag, by the way. So he can feel the indentations of the lines. And if you all have ever done that, if you like in some of the old detective stories, somebody'd write a phone number down and tear the sheet off, and then the detective would run a pencil over the sheet below it, and it'd make the number appear. So he's feeling over the paper and what he's drawing. He says, "Yeah, you're doing fine. Keep going." And at this point, the wife has woken up, and she says, "What are you guys doing?" And Robert says, "We're drawing a cathedral. Me and him. We're working on it." And Robert's actually encouraging him. He's saying, that's it. That's good. That's right. Sure, you got it, bub. I can tell. You didn't think you could, but you can, can't you? You're cooking with gas now. You know what I'm saying? We're going to really have us something here in a minute. So now it's Robert who's encouraging him, Bub, how to do this. Um, and when they finish, he says, "Hey, don't stop now." And the real revelation of it all is that at this point, when they're finishing up the cathedral, Bub has his eyes closed. He's no longer looking at the paper. He's just letting Robert guide his hand. And when they're done, he says, "I think that's it." Robert, this is Robert. Robert says, "I think that's it. I think you got it. Take a look. What do you think?" And then Bub says, the narrator says, "But I had my eyes closed. I thought I'd keep 'em that way for a little longer. I thought it was something I ought to do." "Well," he said, "are you looking?" My eyes were still closed. I was in my house, I knew that, but I didn't feel like I was inside anything. It's really something, I said. So, as you can see, I hope you can see why I think this story has a happy ending. These two guys, vastly different worlds, in every which way. Start off in this incredibly uncomfortable, at least for Bub. I don't think Robert was ever uncomfortable, but they start off in this incredibly uncomfortable situation. Um, Bub is resistant at every step of the way. He does not want to like this guy. He does not want to feel anything for this guy. He's jealous of him. He wants him gone. Um, he's very unhappy with the whole situation. But through this one tiny little event, um, I believe that it changed this guy's outlook in a magnificent way. I mean, in a huge way. I think Bub's going to have a pretty different outlook from here on out. Um, and again, it's a simple story. You can read it. It's straightforward. Uh, Not a lot of real hidden things in it. It's just a good story. And I think what I get out of it is that you know you can honestly think that someone is so entirely different from you that you can't possibly have anything in common, and through something as simple little gestures you can find out, well, hey, we're really not so different, and that most people just kind of want at a very basic level, kind of want the same things out of life. Now, a common question before I go, because I'm kind of going on here, a common question that myself and many people have asked is, well, why did he pick a cathedral? Couldn't it have been anything? Couldn't it have been like you know, and if you all have ever seen any of the cathedrals over, especially, I mean, there's some in the U.S., but the majority of them over in Europe, these things are incredibly complex. I mean, the architecture, the structure, the every aspect of them is incredibly complex. So that itself is a monumental undertaking. And if you think about the construction of the cathedrals, they themselves, I mean, they would take some of the bigger ones took, uh, anywhere from 50 to 100 years and more to even complete. I know Notre Dame in Paris was, I mean, that was started, that was going on for well over 100 years. So you'd have generations of people working on this thing from the same family that never saw the finished product, which is also something that's touched on in the story. Um, but why did he pick a cathedral? Why couldn't it have been like a barn or something like that? And you can look for many different reasons. People, I mean, you could think of, in a sense, that a cathedral is a church, and that's typically a place where people of many different backgrounds and many different races and all kinds of stuff, where it's just where people that are very vastly different meet under one common reason. People from all walks of life, different belief systems, different values, they come together in one place for a common goal. So perhaps that's why he chose the cathedral. Also because it could have been like some kind of an awakening for Bub, which I think it was an epiphany or something, which could be symbolically almost like a religious experience. Well, what better place to have a religious experience than a cathedral? So there's lots of different ways you could look at it, but one thing is absolutely certain is that it is no accident that he chose a cathedral to be the object that brings these two so different and strangers together, because they were strangers up until this night. Everything was what the middle person, the wife, had told each other about each other. The husband only knew what the wife told him about Robert, and Robert only knew what she told him about Bub, about her husband. So I'll go ahead and end it there. I've been going on for way too long. But I think this is just a beautiful story. It's simple, has a great message and a happy ending, and nobody dies. So just keep your eyes peeled. Check D2L at least twice a week, and I'm going to keep putting reading assignments up. I'll keep doing this every week. And don't even, if you want to start thinking about essay 4, go ahead, but I'm not assigning it. You will know when I assign it, and I'll be very clear about it. So have a good day, evening, afternoon, whatever it is when you're watching this, and I'll see y'all next time.